He rose before even the starlight knew it had permission to fade. The field lay beneath a pale shroud of breath-thin vapor, every blade bowed by droplets too small to name yet large enough to glimmer like hidden constellations. The first farmer moved as though carved from the very soil, his footsteps pressing soft indentations that filled instantly with dew. Wind skirted the furrows in hushes, and somewhere beyond the juniper a nightjar gave its last two-syllable note, then tucked its voice away. He paused with palms open, letting silence settle into skin as surely as moisture settled onto leaf. If you've been walking these quiet fields with me tonight, stay a little longer. There is always another story, waiting like a seed beneath the soil. You can plant your own thoughts in the comments. I'll tend to them with care. And if you wish to return, you need only follow the path back here, like the sun finding the same horizon every morning. Subscribe, and the gate to this little village will always be open for you. Now, let's get back to story. There was no hurry. The earth never hurried, and neither did he. He drew a palm across the top layer of silt, feeling how coolness met warmth where his skin hovered. It reminded him of long-ago mornings beside ancient riverbanks when the village was little more than a ring of reed roofs. Back then, water came in restless floods, sweeping away seed and soil alike. But dew arrived meekly, asked nothing, and left gifts. Those first gifts had nursed his earliest barley sprouts when the sky withheld rain, proving patience a far stronger tool than any spade. Tonight's mist had formed thick on the southern stones, slabs of limestone he himself had unearthed seasons earlier, polishing their faces with sand to make them hospitable to droplets. He walked toward them, skirt brushing dry seed heads of last year's emmer. A graceful fox crossed his path, pad silent, nose damp. The farmer inclined his head in greeting. The fox continued, whiskers bead-tipped. Each creature knew this was an hour for collecting small liquids. Near the center of the plot stood 7 willow branches arched low, bound with twisted flax. He had bent them 2 nights ago, trusting the crescent moon's gravity to draw heavier night airs across their leaves. Now each narrow blade glittered. He crouched, palm upward so as not to disturb the beads, and let his fingertips gather the first drop of the day. It rolled from finger to wrist, slow, reluctant to abandon the leaf's green cradle. He lifted the drop to his lips, not to drink, but to taste the story it carried. A faint mineral whisper, perhaps born on distant hills where wind scraped salt from chalk cliffs. In that taste he read the sky's travels, and he thanked it in the silent language of breath. Then work began. Not laborious, but measured, reverent, like reciting a prayer with the body. He unrolled a strip of linen woven by his partner in winters past, each weft thread thick with lanolin-scented wool that caught moisture greedily. Spreading it beneath the willows, he tapped the midribs, nudging hundreds of droplets into cloth. The fabric darkened in blotches, blooming like slow ink. He folded, pressed, and guided water toward the cloth's center seam where it would pool. Already his mind pictured the clay jar with its mended lip, waiting near the granary door. In the east, color stirred, a memory of apricot more than a hue. The farmer closed his eyes, listening to how light made soundless promises. Soon insects would lift their songs, soon seeds would resume their silent upward push. But for now the world inhaled and did not yet exhale. He moved on, linen draped over one arm, to the limestone slabs cooled by night. Their surfaces were miniature skies, irregular, pitted, each depression holding a perfect lens of water. Kneeling, he touched cloth corner to cavity, soaking up tiny heavens one by one. He thought of stories elders once told beside smoke, that dew was the tears of dawn weeping for the loneliness of stars. He did not doubt elders, but he sensed something simpler. Dew was patience made visible, a slow accrual of night's quiet breath. His own patience mirrored it. Years of tending soil had taught that rushing bruised more than it saved. Seeds refused to sprout when pressed into earth without ceremony, and water fled trenches dug with anger. So he embraced slowness, letting task and thought move together like twin oxen under a single yoke. Beyond the slabs lay a ring of stones black as obsidian shards. He had placed them long ago when a traveler from the coastal cliffs spoke of dew mirrors, dark rocks absorbing day heat, then surrendering it to cool night air, coaxing condensation. Tonight the mirrors were crowded with beads, fat as millet grains. He lowered his face close enough to see inverted moonlight inside each sphere. For a moment, he considered leaving them untouched, so beauty might last, but purpose prevailed. He pressed a strip of wool cloth upon the surface, lifting beauty into usefulness. Midway through the gathering, he straightened, stretching vertebrae while gazing south where hills shaped in silhouette leaned against paling sky. Vapor curled along their flanks like sleeping serpents. He wondered whether other farmers awakened there, palms cupped to leaves, sharing this communion unbeknownst to one another. The thought warmed his chest, though dawn air still nipped. Community, he knew, often formed wordlessly, fibers connecting unseen. He returned to the willow troughs and lifted the cloth, heavy now, into a shallow ceramic bowl. With practiced twist he wrung, slow, allowing silver streams to coil. The bowl rang softly as each stream struck its surface. A note too quiet for midday, but perfect for this hour. From bowl to jar he transferred the gathered water, one hand guiding, one steadying. Cracked rim. The jar's earthen scent mingled with faint sweetness of dew, a fragrance he could never name yet always recognized. It was the smell of beginnings. When jar rested half full, he paused. Some dew must remain for soil and beasts. He returned to the willow, shaking cloth gently so remaining droplets fell back upon leaves. He then touched fingertips to ground, drawing a small spiral into silt. A sign of gratitude he adapted from river glyphs learned in youth. The spiral meant cycles, return, the endless breathing of world. He brushed dew from fingertip into the spiral's eye. The first bird of day, a lark, loosed a note light enough to ride vapor. The farmer smiled, feeling the sound lodge inside ribs like a seed poised to germinate. He looked toward the eastern rise, a thin gold thread-stitched horizon to sky. Soon heat would unravel the mist's delicate scarf. Work, therefore, slowed even further, for rushing now would erase what slowness had gained. He placed jar in shadow of an almond tree, knowing cool bark would shield it. Then he simply stood, spine tall, breathing. Memories drifted in, unbidden but unharmed. He recalled a season of drought when even river stones cracked from thirst, when people lined up beneath fig branches to lick dew from undersides of leaves. He had been younger then, driven by urgency, but even in need he noticed how dew calmed hearts. A mother, lips parched, had smiled after tasting a single drop offered by his cupped hands. That smile had lasted longer than water itself. Now, decades later, he gathered not from desperation but from ritual, the ritual of honoring morning. He believed the act itself stitched the village to dawn, reminding all that life began not with sun flare, but with softness, so faint one needed stillness to perceive it. He would distribute this morning's dew to seedlings just sprouted in clay pots, to the goat whose milk fed an orphaned child, to the dye maker who relied on purity for her indigo vats. What remained he would pour at the base of the oldest almond. A breeze arrived, hesitant. testing edges of leaves. The farmer felt it as a cool ribbon over sweat-damp nape. He interpreted its whisper. Time to close the jars. Time to bow to the imminent day. He obeyed, fitting a lid of woven reeds across earthen mouth, securing it with braid of date palm fiber. The jar made a gentle click, sound of night's labor sealing itself. Yet the gathering was not finished. He sensed, always, one last moment the sky offered. An extra breath where dew still clung in secret hollows. He walked toward a cluster of chickweed whose micro-hairs trapped mist like lace. Kneeling once more, he brushed hands across leaves, letting droplets fall into cupped palm. He did not bottle these. Instead, he tipped them back upon the plant. A circle complete in seconds. Light had now grown bold enough to tint clouds rose and peach. In that color, silhouettes lost sharpness. Edges softened. The farmer felt weight of jar and crook of arm, familiar as a sleeping child. He began moving toward the granary, where cool stone floors would shelter the water until distribution. Each step pressed dew into earth. Each exhalation became part of rising day heat shimmer. Still, he was not finished. He turned once more to look at willow arches, cloth now lying in grass, damp, content. Between branches lingered threads of mist, silver and moving. He could almost see them weave themselves into stories the village children would hear at night, tales of how dew taught patience, how invisible hands filled jars when everyone slept. The sun's rim breached horizon, and instantly skylarks multiplied their hymn. He heard potters stirring in distant sheds, the thump of hoof against gatepost, and simmering coals exhaling spark. But within these newborn noises resided the memory of the silence that came before, and he carried it like a hidden spring inside chest. Dawn was no longer fragile, it was awake, stretching. The farmer placed cloth over shoulder to dry and headed onward. Ahead waited distribution, seed choosing. Conversations murmured over stone thresholds. Behind lay willow leaves trembling with evaporating beads, limestone slabs now plain, obsidian mirrors dulled. Yet he sensed that dew would form again, inevitable as breath, and he smiled. For gathering was less a task than a promise he kept with morning. As he reached the edge of the field, passing beneath the almond tree whose roots awaited their share, he paused, hand resting on trunk. A shaft of sun caught the jar, igniting a prism through its flawed lip. Colors sprayed across his tunic, fleeting as insects' wings. He watched them until they faded, then whispered thanks once more. To water, to night, to the patience that binds moments together. He did not quicken pace. The day could wait a heartbeat longer. He wanted one last inhale of coolness before heat arrived. Closing his eyes, he felt breeze shift directions, scented now with distant sage. Somewhere, another farmer might already be waking to find cloth still dry, night air having given little. The thought summoned gentle ache, a desire to share this gathered gift beyond his own valley. Perhaps tomorrow he would travel, jar in hand, to that hill country. But that was a plan for another mist-born dawn, and such plans preferred silence. Within the cool alcove of the granary, he settled the jar upon a cedar shelf where dust drifted like pale pollen through beams of surprised sunlight. A river pebble, smooth as milk, became its lid's guardian, a small moon to keep water dreaming. Grain baskets slept nearby, husks whispering as air warmed. He crouched to listen, hearing how each seed, pressed against neighbor, made a hush like wind over distant dunes. That hush reminded him why dew mattered. Not for thirst alone, but for quiet, for the stilling of restless thoughts. A groan rode the rafters as clay tiles stretched in morning heat. He touched one and felt thumbprints of potters who shaped it generations ago. Their patience still lingered in terracotta, granting Ruth the stoicism to endure midsummer storms. He smiled at the inheritance and stepped outside, blinking at brightness that made field stones glitter. Residual beads flashed, then faded, entering sky as invisible offerings. He watched their vanishing without regret, knowing transformation was simply another form of presence. Before attending heavier chores, he walked the boundary barefoot, reading soil the way elders read smoke. Ants converged where ground cracked, forming dark constellations. Chickweed leaves cupped miniature puddles. A distant saffron scent climbed warm air to announce mid-spring's advance. Each subtle sign told him how tomorrow's branches must bend, how cloth should rest, how stone should face prevailing breeze. Knowledge arrived without language, patterns braided into muscle memory through seasons of noticing. At the northern edge, he knelt beside a yearling almond, buds pink at tips, bark still tender. One fingertip, still wet with dew's remnant, touched the bud, and moisture slipped inside living wood. His grandmother's whisper echoed, "Water knows water." The belief needed no proof. The tree would answer in its own slow grammar, sending roots deeper by night. He rose, spine crackling softly, and pictured willow arches awaiting slight adjustment to greet the next lunar pull. He returned, basket in hand, to those arches, fingers loosening flax knots with practiced delicacy. Each branch released a faint sigh as angle changed, leaf edges trembling. A solitary droplet survived, landing cold upon his forearm. He let it linger until sun claimed it. Around him, the field awakened. Goat bells rang faintly, children's laughter threaded through far lanes, but work remained hushed. He hummed a melody with no beginning, keeping pace with heartbeat, letting air shape tune. When hawk shadow skimmed the grass, he paused to scan horizon. Light now stood tall, yet he felt days wait lightly, anchored by the jar cooling in granary shade. Tomorrow's gathering already bloomed in mind, cloth rinsed in ash water, stones realigned, reed straws cut anew. Those thoughts settled like seeds in fresh furrow, needing only time. For now, he replaced knots, lifted basket, and began the slow walk back toward Cedar Door. Dawn had matured into morning, but he carried its hush within every breath. Before entering shade, he halted beside obsidian mirrors, now dull under sun yet still warm with story. Kneeling, he traced a fingertip across their uneven faces, leaving pale streaks of dust. He remembered when the coastal traveler demonstrated how dark stone coaxed water from sky. The man spoke in a dialect thick with sea wind, yet concept transcended speech. Today, years later, the mirrors lived on, black eyes watching seasons turn. He lifted one shard, small enough to fit his palm, intending to reshape edge so it would catch droplets more kindly. Turning it toward light, he saw his own reflection fractured into tiny suns. He smiled, not at himself, but at the many dawns captured there, and set the stone back, now angled toward prevailing breeze. That single adjustment felt equal to planting a tree. Tomorrow, perhaps 2 extra drops would fall. He strolled toward the herb patch where lamb's ear, chamomile, and creeping thyme formed a quilt of muted greens. Dew had beaded their fine hairs earlier, now leaves shone matte. He knelt to thin sprouts, guiding sun to lower stems, and placed cold shoots in basket. They would flavor tonight's broth. Earth smelled of new roots and distant rain. While working, he recalled a drought season when he'd gathered dew not for seedlings, but for mothers with cracked lips. The memory hummed with humility, reminding him that abundance and scarcity were pages of the same scroll. He whispered gratitude to the patch, to his own 2 hands, to the unseen clouds scripting future mists. Finally, shadows shortened, signaling time to leave field to heat and buzzing cicadas. He tipped his hat of plaited reeds, letting air cool forehead, then turned toward the granary where shelter waited. Each step lifted small puffs of dust, sowing foot-shaped clouds behind him. In the hush between those breaths, he whispered a promise, to meet horizon again before stars paled, jar in hand, heart uncluttered. The vow did not feel heavy. It floated like chaff on wind, settling only when ready. Near the granary door he paused, sensing morning's hush still clinging to shoulders. He inhaled its ghost, then crossed threshold, letting daylight follow at its own pace. Inside, cool shadow folded around him, and the cedar shelf awaited the basket's weight. He set it down, then ran palm across jar's curved side, feeling how moisture within pressed faint chill outward. Soon he would divide its contents, some for seed trays, some for the dye maker, a sip for the goat. But for the moment he simply rested beside it, listening to the tiny plinks of water settling. Beyond earthen walls, daylight expanded, stirring village life. Yet here, clouds of last night still floated inside Jar's glassy heart. He imagined them drifting above barley fields in some miniature world, raining generosity on toy sprouts. The thought coaxed a quiet laugh, low and warm. Then he straightened, checking that linen hung to dry where breeze could reach, and drew in a final breath of granary coolness. Work would continue, but dawn had not yet fully loosened its embrace, and he chose to linger within that softness a little longer, still. By the time the sun had passed its early yawn and climbed above the eastern ridge, the farmer had already walked the entire boundary of his field twice. Not out of worry had no place in this life of listening, but as ritual, the way one checks the breath of the world by walking its pulse. The basket now rested in the shade of the granary wall, dew distributed with care, cloths drying on river stone, and the jar back on its cedar shelf. But his mind drifted toward what tomorrow needed. The next gathering would require branches. Not just any, but those that could bend without breaking. Those that remembered wind and could speak its language. The farmer understood the arc of a branch like he understood the arc of a sunrise. Both had their purpose, and both took shaping. Not all branches were ready to bow, and not all would return to their original form. Some would snap if asked too soon. And so, with his woven belt slung across his shoulder, he set off beyond the herbs, past the grain-drying racks toward the grove. The path there was soft underfoot, worn by seasons and souls. Birds flitted low, and grass brushed his calves, glistening from where the dew still clung in corners the sun had not yet reached. He walked in the shadow of tall tamarisks and young fig trees, where the breeze made a song out of dry leaves and long silence. He didn't speak. Trees listened best when humans did not interrupt. His fingers traced trunks as he passed, reading bark like a potter reads the bottom of a fired bowl, looking for hairline signs, for stories beneath surface. He stopped beneath a willow that had grown in solitude, its boughs long, fingers of green trailing almost to the ground. This one had a memory for water. It had once grown near a stream, long since vanished into cracked earth, but its roots still sought echoes of that moisture. He looked up at it with quiet reverence. To ask a branch to bend was to ask a memory to shift, gently, carefully. He brought forth a strip of soaked flax and twisted it in his hands to warm it. He began by brushing his hand down a likely branch, murmuring wordless breath along the bark, the way he had been taught. Then, slowly, he eased the branch downward, guiding it toward a stake he pressed into the soil. The branch creaked. not in protest, but like an old man settling onto a stone bench. It yielded, reluctantly, but not unkindly. He tied it with the flax, not tightly, but like a whispered promise. Just hold this shape for a little while. Further along the grove, he did the same to a slender fig limb. Fig was different, more rigid, more proud, but its pride was soft around midday when sun warmed its sap. He waited, sitting beneath the tree, chewing on a thread of sweetgrass as bees murmured somewhere behind him. When the time felt right, he moved with confidence and grace, coaxing the arc without force. It held. He smiled. Every branch had a different temperament, and knowing this was not something learned in a scroll, but in bone and time. 3 more he bent that afternoon. Some tamarisk, some wild olive. He sought diversity not just for strength, but for story. Each type of branch sang a different note in the dew's chorus. Some cradled the moisture loosely, letting it slip. Others cupped it tight, delaying the fall until the farmer nudged it free. Together, they taught him the ways of droplets, how they landed, held, and moved. He returned near sunset, arms a little tired, hands sap-stained. Behind him, the trees stood altered, leaning now in strange half-gestures, caught mid-bow like dancers frozen mid-prayer. They would hold their shape until the morning mist came again. Then, once their role was fulfilled, he would release them, let them straighten, and thank them softly. Nothing in the world liked being bent too long. Back at the edge of the field, he shaped small mounds of earth to support each stake, adjusting the placement by fingertip instinct. Where the ground was too dry, he pressed in his heel and tilted it deeper. Where it crumbled, he let it be, knowing even failure had its rhythm. He moved like a shadow cast by a slower sun, always present, never abrupt. At dusk, a neighbor passed along the far ridge, a silhouette carrying a basket of herbs. They raised a hand, and the farmer returned the gesture, each too far for words, but not for acknowledgement. The breeze carried the smell of thyme, and the air shifted from warm to whispering. He pulled his shawl tighter. The branches were in place now. They would drink the air while he slept. Before retiring, he visited each one again, placing a stone near the root, a small token of gratitude. One stone was smooth, river-washed, another jagged like a mountain edge. The farmer believed in giving the trees variety too, so they could remember the world beyond their roots. Each object told a story of movement, and the trees listened even in stillness. In the final light, he sat by the last willow, watching as the sky melted from copper to ink. Bats traced lazy arcs above the granary roof. From somewhere behind, a child's laughter rang once, then disappeared like a spark into ash. The farmer closed his eyes. Tomorrow, the branches would gather dew, but tonight they bowed. Not in submission, not in sorrow, but in readiness. The stars emerged one by one, like dew forming in the heavens. And the farmer, hands resting on knees, stayed still a little longer, letting the world shape him just as he had shaped the branches. When he rose, it was slow, like moss growing upward. No sound marked his retreat, only the faint rustle of leaves accepting their task. The night deepened behind him, and the earth turned without rush. The morning came softly, as it always did, without needing to be announced. The first farmer woke before it fully arrived, his eyes opening not to light, but to that quiet gray moment when the world still feels half-dreamed. In that hour, dew gathers in silence, forming along the edges of things, on leaves, on skin, on the backs of stones. And it was those stones that called him now, the ones he had chosen seasons ago, placed with care, and learned to read like a second language. He stood slowly, letting the sleep fall from his limbs like the mist slipping off a branch. His fingers closed around a small cloth, already damp from the air, and he draped it over his shoulder. The basket waited near the doorway, the same one he had carried since the first year he began this work. Its weave was looser now, reeds slightly frayed, but it still held purpose. As he stepped outside, a hush met him, not empty, but full of expectation. The sky above was pearl-colored, cloudless and still. The path to the stone ring was worn smooth by footsteps, by patience. He walked it as though returning to an old friend, his movements unhurried, steady, measured with the breath of the land. Birds had not yet begun their chorus, and the only sound was the hush of dew being born, tiny sighs from every surface touched by sky. He passed the grove where branches still held their bows, collecting moisture leaf by leaf. He would return to them later. First, he needed the stones. The ring was simple, ancient, deliberate. Not a circle, not a square, but an in-between shape, born not of geometry but of intuition. Each stone had been chosen not for beauty, but for how it responded to heat, to night, to the weight of air. There were dark slabs of basalt, speckled granite, shards of slot, and smooth-faced limestone. The oldest were river stones, worn flat by forgotten currents and now reborn in stillness. He crouched beside the westernmost slab, the one that always gathered dew first. Its surface was dimpled from years of exposure, shallow hollows perfect for holding the sky's breath. This morning, each depression cradled a bead, perfectly round, perfectly still. He leaned closer and saw his own reflection, fragmented, sleepy-eyed, cradled in water. He did not smile, but he felt the curve of peace in his chest. With the corner of the cloth, he gently blotted the surface. The stone made no sound, but he imagined it exhaling. The cloth darkened as it absorbed the droplets, and he moved slowly, reverently. There was no room here for haste. Rushing would disturb the balance. The dew would flee, or worse, be wasted. He pressed, lifted, moved, pressed again, each motion as fluid as the water he collected. The next stone was colder, an oblong piece of granite that refused to warm even in summer. Its surface held fewer beads, but those it offered were larger, heavier, as if the night had lingered there longer. He placed a finger on one, and it broke apart instantly, soaking his skin. He whispered a breath, not a word, but an offering, and resumed. He moved around the ring, clockwise as he always did. Not because someone had taught him to, but because the sun would eventually follow that same path. It felt respectful, as if he were walking alongside the light. Each stone held its own temperament. Some gave easily, others withheld. Some clung to water long after sunrise, while others surrendered their gift at the first warmth. He didn't judge them, he simply noticed. As he worked, the cloth grew heavier. Drops slid down his forearms, cool and slow, tracing veins like rivers returning to their source. A breeze stirred through the grass, and he paused to let it touch his face. There was a silence to the moment that needed no interruption. In that pause, he looked up at the horizon. Mist was lifting now, curling upward like breath from sleeping mouths. The world was waking. Beside one stone, a small spider had spun a web between two pebbles. Its strands glistened with dew, more beautiful than anything the farmer had shaped. He did not disturb it. He crouched nearby and waited, watching as the wind trembled the web, sending droplets sliding along silken threads. Some fell, some held. All was motion, all was stillness. When he resumed his gathering, he worked around the spider's space, respectful of its labor. That, too, was part of the morning's rhythm, knowing when not to touch. The dew was not his to own. It was a conversation, not a possession. He had learned this in hard seasons, when the sky offered nothing, and his hands returned from the field as dry as the stones themselves. He reached the flat shale slab he had placed near the ring's center, a newer addition. It had taken time to weather properly, to stop rejecting the water. Now it gleamed. The farmer knelt beside it and noticed a single, perfect drop resting in its middle, a tiny, weightless eye. He bent close and whispered, not to the stone, but to the air, "Thank you." Then he lifted the drop into his cloth, as gently as lifting a newborn bird. The cloth was nearly full now. He folded it carefully, not to squeeze, but to cradle. He would wring it later, near the jar, in the shadow where coolness stayed longest. For now, he let it rest against his side, the gathered water pressing lightly against his ribs. He ran his hand along the stone's surface once more, not for dew, but to feel its memory. Stones held stories, older than fire, older than seed. He stood, back creaking slightly, and looked at what remained. The dew was fading. Where once beads clung, now shimmered only residue. The sun had risen higher, its warmth stealing what little moisture was left. But the farmer did not grieve the vanishing. The dew had done what it was meant to do, arrive quietly, offer its gift, and disappear. He took one last walk around the ring, his shadow longer now, stretching thin across the stones. He nodded at each, a silent farewell until tomorrow. As he passed the obsidian slab, his favorite, though he'd never say so, he paused. Its surface was dry already, yet it still reflected sky. Even in absence, it remembered. That was enough. With the cloth secure, he made his way back toward the granary. The path was warmer now, sun warming the soles of his feet through worn leather. Birds had begun their chatter in earnest, and insects flitted low among the grasses. The field felt brighter, livelier, but he carried a pocket of silence with him still. The hush of the stones, the stillness of dew. At the threshold, he placed the cloth in a shallow bowl, waiting for the final drops to gather. He did not wring it immediately. Some things, like stories and water, needed time to come together. He leaned against the doorframe, watching the last tendrils of mist rise from the fields. In the corner, the jar waited, half full, half expectant. Soon it would receive the morning's gift. But for now, the farmer remained still, one hand resting on the frame, the other brushing the hem of his tunic where it touched the cloth. The stones were behind him, cooling further beneath the sun. Tomorrow they would drink again. And he would return, not to take, but to witness, to collect what the night had offered, and to give it back in ways that could not be seen. And though his work was not yet done, he did not move just yet. The moment held, the morning held, the memory of dew on stone held, and in that holding the farmer breathed, slow, long, full, and the breath carried the hush of cool stone backs into the warmth of the day. The granary was quiet when he stepped back inside, the day now fully formed beyond its earthen walls. Shafts of sun filtered through the slatted vents high in the walls, catching the dust as it floated like seedless pollen. The bowl on the shelf shimmered faintly, dew slowly gathering at its base from the soaked cloth he had placed there earlier. But his eyes weren't on the water now. They were on the folded bundle of linen beside it. Clean, light, carefully woven, and touched only by sun and hands. He reached for it with the same reverence he gave to seedlings or fire. This cloth, light as mist and just as quiet, was a tool more ancient than many knew. Before jars and pottery, before stone rings and seedbeds, the cloth had been the dew-gatherer. Before the world knew how to store, it had learned how to receive. And that is what this cloth did. It received what the air offered. No need to trap or force. Just place, wait, lift. He cradled the linen, and it sighed in his arms like something living. It had taken weeks to make, not all at once, not hurried, but slowly. Threads twisted from flax soaked and softened in river mud, dried in wind, combed smooth with fishbone teeth. He remembered how his partner had sat beneath the almond tree, weaving it with fingers like music, each thread a line in a song only they two could hum. The weave was tight, but not rigid, meant to mimic the way grasses bend and breathe. That was the trick. Cloth had to move like air if it was to catch the sky's moisture. He unfolded it on the stone floor, watching how the light played on its surface. Pale gray with a shimmer of warmth, like old moonlight spread thin. He thought of the name villagers had given it, mooncloth. Not because it came from the moon, but because it could only do its work before the sun arrived. Once light touched it, the spell broke. Only night's quiet breath could fill it. And so, he handled it now like a twilight ritual, knowing that soon he would lay it in the field once more. With slow hands, he gathered the cloth, folded it into a long ribbon, and stepped out into the warmth. The field was humming now, bees in the lavender, birds in the fig trees, the sun high and sure. But he looked only at the patch of ground he had prepared near the eastern wall. It was flat, shaded just enough, the soil tamped down by feet and smoothed by palm, a resting place for the mooncloth. He knelt, pressing fingers into earth, feeling for memory. Yes, the spot still held the chill of night, a little echo of where dew had touched before. He laid the cloth down, unrolling it like a scroll of sky. Its edges curled slightly, responding to the warmth beneath, and he pressed stones gently along the borders to keep it in place. Each stone chosen not just for weight, but for their stories. River-polished, ash-colored, etched with lichen. The cloth welcomed them like friends. Then he stepped back, kneeling once again to watch. There was no dew now, of course, not under this bold sun, but he could see the cloth already learning the ground, remembering the curve of slope, the rise of wind. Tonight, when darkness returned, and mist crept low along the roots, this cloth would drink. He would not need to squeeze or press. By morning, it would be damp, heavy with the invisible labor of night. He would then wring it gently into a bowl, let it pool, then pour it into the jar. But that came later. Now was for setting, for listening. He walked to the fig tree nearby and sat beneath it, letting the day lean into his bones. In his lap he placed another cloth, an older one, worn and patched, and began to mend a tear with quiet thread. As he worked, he remembered the first time he saw dew gathered this way. He had been a boy then, no older than a winter almond, watching his grandmother rise before dawn to lay her cloths across the meadow grass. He remembered her patience, the way she smoothed the fabric with her bare feet, whispering to the wind as she worked. He had asked her why she spoke to the wind, and she had said, because it listens. And sometimes it carries water in its hands. At the time he hadn't understood, but now, sitting beneath the same sky, preparing cloths the same way, he understood that it wasn't about the cloth at all. It was about the invitation. The cloth was merely a sign that someone was listening, someone was waiting, someone was willing to receive. He finished the mending, tied off the thread, and folded the cloth again. Then he stood, stretched, and returned to the mooncloth. It had settled now, shaped itself to the rise and dip of the land. It looked like it belonged there, as if it had always been part of the field. He smiled, reached down and touched one corner. Still dry, but not for long. The sun dipped lower in the sky, shadows lengthened, and the warmth began to slip from the earth like water through fingers. He waited until the last bee had returned to its hive, until the birds had gone quiet, until the air itself began to cool. Then, with the same care he had used to lay it, he lifted the cloth and shook it gently, just to loosen the dust, not to disturb its memory. He brought it inside, hung it across the beam where shadows gathered thickest, and let it rest. Later that night, when stars blinked in the still sky and the only sound was the hush of wind through barley stalks, he rose. The field was silver with moonlight, the stones cool again, the world waiting. He stepped barefoot into the mist, carrying the cloth like a sacred thing. At the place he had chosen, he knelt and spread it once more, this time without stones. The air was still. The sky held its breath. He sat beside it, arms wrapped around knees, watching. Watching as beads began to form at the edge of the cloth, small at first, then more, then many. They gathered not because of anything he did, but because of how he waited. The cloth darkened slowly, line by line, as though the moon were writing a letter across its threads. He did not move, he only breathed, and the cloth breathed with him. At some point, long past midnight, he leaned back onto the grass, watching clouds pass like silent boats across the stars. The cloth lay beside him, alive with moisture, alive with patience. And as he drifted toward sleep, he felt the weight of the night not as burden, but as blessing. The cloth would gather until morning. He would rise and return, and the dew would be waiting. Not because it had to be, but because he had made a place for it. Morning drifted in, veiled in the lightest silver, softer than sleep, and the first farmer opened his eyes to the quiet sound of leaves exhaling. Not the rustle of wind, not yet, but the sighing hush that came when dew grew heavy, when each stalk in the field carried a bead or two of night's patience on its back. He sat up slowly, not to break the stillness, but to become part of it. Around him, the world was holding its breath in droplets, and nestled in the far eastern edge of his field, the dew garden was waiting. He stood, taking with him the memory of warmth left by his sleep, and moved barefoot through the low grass. The path to the dew garden was not a marked one. There were no stones to line the way, no grooves pressed by wheels or sandals, only a way his body knew, a silent track traced by habit, shaped by years of rising early and walking before words. Birds were not yet singing, but the barley rustled softly, brushing his ankles with wetness, like a welcome or a remembering. The air was cool and kind. Everything still belonged to the hours before the sun claimed its full name. The dew garden was not a true garden, not in the way his neighbors spoke of theirs. It did not grow food. There were no vegetables here, no rows to till or seeds to reap. This garden had been sown with a different intent. Here, he had planted only those soft-stemmed, tender-leaved companions that drank from the night, plants whose skin held water as if it were memory. He had learned their names over years, and some had no names at all, but he knew them by feel, by weight, by the way their leaves darkened with dew and shimmered at first light. There was lamb's ear, thick and soft as wool, each leaf like a tongue cradling droplets with gentle certainty. Chickweed, low and spreading, with its starry white flowers and tiny dew-cupping hairs. Chamomile, whose yellow eyes blinked slowly in the mist, and whose scent rose like the memory of warm tea. Wild purslane, sweet and waxy, gathering beads of water that glistened in the crooks of its stems. And among them a few stranger guests, a fern with frilled fingers, a creeping herb that he'd found on a northern hillside, its name unknown, but its thirst familiar. He crouched low at the garden's edge, careful not to disturb the leaves. The ground here was soft, rich with mulch from seasons past. Leaf fall, broken stems, wind-blown seeds. He reached out and touched a lamb's ear leaf, the dew clinging to its velvet with perfect stillness. His finger did not press, only hovered, letting the chill drift into his skin. He cupped a leaf beneath it with his palm and tapped the stem ever so slightly. The drop slid off, silent, and landed in his hand like a whisper. He smiled and brought it to his lips, not to drink but to feel. Dew from these plants tasted different, not the minerality of stone-gathered drops, nor the soft woodiness of cloth-gathered water. This dew tasted green, delicate, alive with the breath of the plant that had cradled it. It was not meant for jars. It was meant to be returned to the soil, to nourish the same roots that held it overnight. And yet he always took a few drops, with reverence, to learn what the night had written. He moved slowly through the patch, knees damp from soil, hands open. Some mornings he carried a shell bowl made from river clam, smooth and shallow, to collect the dew as a kind of essence. Not for drinking, not for use. Just to hold, to behold. He filled it part way, letting it reflect the sky above, fractured through the wobbling surface. A cloud passed, then a bird. The reflection trembled, then stilled. He set the bowl in the center of the garden and let it rest there like an offering. All around, the garden exhaled. Mist rose from the mulch, curling between stems. A beetle climbed the stalk of chickweed, brushing against dew and carrying it like a jewel on its back. A spider web at the edge, spun low between fennel and thyme, shone with dozens of drops, each one a captured breath of sky. He watched it sway, gently, and gave it wide space as he stepped past. He knelt at the base of a chamomile cluster and pressed the soil gently with his thumb. It was moist, dark, content. No need to water today. He brushed fallen petals into a little pile and left them for the wind. Nothing in the dew garden was taken quickly. It was a place of pause. Each plant had been chosen for how it held time. Some held it tightly, refusing to surrender their moisture even when the sun rose. Others gave freely, their leaves dripping before first light. Together, they taught him what waiting meant. He remembered when he first thought of such a garden. It was after a dry season, when dew had been scarce and mornings brittle. He had wandered into the woods at the edge of the hill and found a patch of lamb's ear growing in shadow. The rest of the world had withered, but there, beneath the hush of pine and ash, those leaves still glistened. He had returned that day with a handful of soil from the grove, and he planted it here, in the quietest corner of his field. From that one planting, this garden had grown, not quickly, not evenly, but in the slow, companionable way that dew itself grows. He rose and stepped back, looking over the leaves now heavy with moisture. The garden did not need him this morning. That was the secret. It never needed him. It only waited for him to notice. And in doing so, it taught him how to be present, not to act, but to observe, not to take, but to witness. He walked the garden's perimeter, a soft curve worn into the earth by years of footsteps. Each step matched a memory. Here was where the thyme first spread wild, uninvited, but welcome. There was the corner where a late frost had curled the lamb's ear to black, only for it to return thicker the next season. In the far edge, he found a new shoot. Unplanned, unexpected, dew dappled. He knelt and touched it, letting his finger rest gently on its leaf. It pulsed beneath his touch, faint but real, life rising to meet him even now. The sun had begun to edge higher, and the garden began its slow shimmer of retreat. Droplets lifted into light, some falling, some vanishing into air. The spell was ending, not broken but fulfilled. He gathered the cloth from his shoulder, knelt once more, and touched the leaves again, this time to release, not to collect. He brushed the dew back onto the soil, where it disappeared like a blessing returned. No part of it was wasted. Every drop found its way. He stood one last time, bowl in hand, now only half full, and held it toward the sun. The water inside flickered with brightness, then steadied. He tipped it gently at the base of a fern, the liquid falling in 3 soft streams, darkening the soil for a breath, then fading. The fern shivered once, then stood still again. The dew garden was quiet now, its work complete. The farmer lingered at its edge, eyes closed, listening to the slow heartbeat of leaves returning to their daytime selves. Behind him, the rest of the field waited, the branches with their bent backs, the stones with their sun-warmed faces, the cloths drying in the shade. But here, for a moment longer, he stayed. And when he finally turned away, he did not look back. He did not need to. The garden would be there tomorrow. It would gather and glisten and wait, just as it always had, just as it always would. It was one of those mornings when the air felt thinner than usual, as if the sky had drawn in its breath and forgotten to release it. The first farmer opened his eyes not to the shimmer of dew, but to a certain stillness, a dryness that clung to the light, to the silence, to the skin of the world. He sat up slowly and listened, not for sound, but for absence. There was no hush of mist rising, no gentle drip from overfilled leaves, no weight of water waiting to be gathered. The dew had not come. He stood without rush, feet finding the coolness of packed soil beside his sleeping mat. The sky above was clear, too clear. No haze softened the horizon. The edges of the day were sharp, etched, unblinking. He stepped outside, and even the trees seemed to be holding back, their leaves quiet, still, unoffered. A breeze moved through the barley, but it was not the moist breath of pre-dawn. It was dry, hollow, a wind that had traveled far and carried nothing. His eyes moved to the ring of stones. Usually, at this hour, their surfaces shimmered with beads, tiny, perfect mirrors of the sky. Today, they were bare, clean, yes, cold, yes, but dry. He stepped to the first one and placed his hand on its back, feeling the warmth already beginning to rise. A night had passed, and yet no dew had settled on its skin. He nodded once, not in disappointment, but in understanding. There would be mornings like this. The world did not owe water. It only offered when it could. He moved past the stones and into the grove, where the bent branches arched like dancers mid-bow. Their leaves, too, were dry. No droplets clung to their tips, no wetness pooled at the base of each blade. He touched one branch lightly, and it trembled at his finger but did not drip. He stood beside it for a while, hands at his sides, breathing slowly. The wind whispered again, skimming across the grove, but it carried no promise. Just a cool echo of something distant. In the dew garden, the story was the same. Lamb's ear, usually heavy with moisture, was simply soft and silver this morning. Chamomile petals lifted gently in the breeze, but no beads traced their edges. Even the chickweed lay quiet, its tiny hairs empty. He knelt and placed his palm flat on the ground, pressing into the mulch, and it greeted him with warmth. Not the coolness of damp earth, but the dry, baked texture of a waiting field. He did not curse the wind. He did not speak to the sky in anger. These mornings came like unexpected guests, and he had long since learned to receive them with the same patience he gave the rest. He sat beside the garden and let the emptiness settle into him like dust. Some might call this a failure of nature, a missed blessing, a broken ritual. But he did not see it that way. The absence of dew was a message, too, a pause in the conversation, and he knew how to listen to pauses. The cloth he had laid out the night before, washed and smoothed and pinned gently between stones, was almost entirely dry. A faint shadow of a few drops quickly gone. He lifted it gently, as one might lift a child too, tired to wake, and folded it into his arms. Even dry, the cloth was sacred. Its emptiness had meaning. It had kept its place through the night, waiting in case the wind brought moisture. It had remained faithful, and that, too, was worth honoring. He returned to the granary, cloth folded, hands quiet. Inside, the jar stood where he'd left it, its contents unchanged. Today, no new water would join the pool. But he did not reach for the lid. Instead, he simply sat beside it, placed the dry cloth beside the cool clay, and closed his eyes. He imagined the wind brushing over distant hills, through hollows where no farmer stood, over stones no hand had placed. Perhaps it had carried dew elsewhere. Perhaps it had left its gift in a different field. The thought brought no bitterness, only wonder. The world was wide, and the wind was free. He could not gather every drop. Nor should he. There was beauty in not being chosen sometimes. There was tenderness in waiting, in being ready, even if the gift did not arrive. He rose and walked outside again, letting the sun kiss his shoulders as he stepped through the barley. The plants did not seem bothered. They stood upright, steady, their roots still holding what yesterday had given. He walked to the stream at the edge of the land, a small ribbon of water that hadn't yet dried despite the thinning rains. There, he crouched and cupped water in his palms, splashing it onto his face, neck, arms. It was not dew. It was not sky-given, but it was water. It cooled him, reminded him that the earth still carried enough, that not every drink must arrive on velvet leaves or polished stones. Some came from deeper places, older places. As he sat on the bank, letting the droplets dry on his skin, he thought of all the farmers who had come before him, those who had waited through longer silences, harsher droughts, lonelier winds. They had learned, as he had, that the task was not to demand, but to be ready, to prepare the cloths, bend the branches, polish the stones, not for certainty, but for the chance that dew might come. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, and he stood, turning into it. His tunic flared around his legs, and the dry air swept across his cheeks like a warning and a blessing. He closed his eyes and let it pass through him, over him, around him. It rattled the grove, shook the cloth line, danced across the field, and when it faded, he felt lighter. As though something had been taken, yes, but also as though something had been given in return. He returned to the dew garden once more before the sun reached its height. The plants still stood. The soil still held its shape. Nothing had been lost, just delayed. He walked between the rows, not touching this time, only watching. The garden didn't mourn. The leaves didn't sulk. They simply waited. That was the lesson. That was always the lesson. Tomorrow, perhaps, the dew would come again. Or perhaps not. He would still wake. He would still prepare the stones, lay the cloth, bow the branches. He would still kneel beside the lamb's ear and wait for the first drop to slide into his palm. He would still walk the path the same way, even if his hands returned empty. Because gathering wasn't only about taking. It was about showing up, about standing still enough, long enough, soft enough that the sky might notice. Might reach down with one wet fingertip and offer a gift, or not. Either way, the ritual remained. The rhythm endured. The field remembered. The cloth waited. And the wind, whether full or empty, always passed through. And as the sun climbed higher, the first farmer turned once more toward the granary and began preparing the cloth for nightfall, just as he always did, just as he always would. That evening, after the wind had passed and the sky folded itself into dusk like a quiet blanket, the first farmer sat beside the granary wall with a bundle of fresh flax in his lap. His hands moved slowly, separating strands with a rhythm so old it had become instinct. Even in the failing light, his fingers remembered the motions. But tonight, something felt different in the motion. Slower, yes, but also more deliberate, more tender. He paused for a moment, looking down at his weathered hands, the lines across his knuckles like dried riverbeds. They had gathered so much, shaped so much, yet they still moved with care. He remembered a time, long ago, when they had not. Back then, they had trembled, uncertain, eager, too rough. He had been a boy, not much taller than a stalk of barley, watching his grandmother lay out the cloths before dawn. He had begged to help, to gather the dew like she did, with such grace and patience. But when she finally handed him the soft linen and showed him how to lift the beads from the chickweed leaves, his hands had scattered every drop. His fingers had pressed too hard or moved too fast. The dew had vanished before he could understand how it had come to be. She had not scolded him. She had only smiled, her eyes full of the long patience that dew requires. "You must learn to move like mist," she'd whispered, brushing the back of his hand with her own. Not like wind. Wind forgets, mist remembers. And so he had practiced. Not by force, but by waiting. Not by taking, but by receiving. And now, years later, as the flax unwound beneath his thumbs, his hands moved as if they had always known. He rose with the finished thread and walked to the willow grove where the dew cloths hung, drying in the breeze. The light was nearly gone, but he could still see the fine weave glinting like water. One cloth had frayed at the edge, its corner unraveling. He crouched and tied it with the flax thread he had just twisted, the knot small, soft, barely visible. As he did, he thought of his younger hands again, how clumsy they had been, how desperate to help, how loud. And yet the dew had taught him each morning how to quiet them. He thought of the first time he had truly gathered a drop, not by accident, not by speed, but with intention. He had crept to the lamb's ear plant before sunrise, watched as a single bead quivered at the edge of the leaf. He had lifted his hand slowly, slowly, breath held, spine still. His finger had come beneath it, not above, and the drop had slid gently onto his skin like a blessing. It had felt like holding a pearl made of sky. He had not spoken, not moved. Just sat, with that one drop trembling in his palm, afraid it might vanish if he blinked. Since then, he had gathered thousands of drops. From stone, from leaf, from cloth, from air itself. But that first one had taught him more than all the others combined. It had taught him that gentleness is not weakness, that stillness is a kind of strength, that to hold water without breaking it, one must forget the need to grasp. Now, in the dimming field, he watched the cloth settle against the stakes. His fingers moved to smooth it, the motion light as moth wings. He thought of how much had changed since that first drop, and how much had not. His hands were older, yes, calloused and sun-browned, but the way he touched the dew was the same, with wonder, with care, with the fingers of a child who had finally learned to listen. He wandered to the edge of the garden where a wild fern had recently begun to grow. It was a shy thing, curling tight against itself, hiding its fronds from the open field, but it held dew beautifully. Tiny beads nestled in the curls like secrets. He crouched beside it and traced one spiral with the tip of his finger. The dew didn't move. It simply shimmered. He smiled, not because he needed it to, but because it reminded him of something forgotten, the awe of small things. He stayed beside the fern for a while, letting his hand rest near the soil, not touching anything now, just offering presence. The stars blinked into view above him, one by one, and the air grew cool with sleep. The cloths behind him fluttered, and the trees began their night sway, leaves murmuring ancient songs. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind them, he saw again the trembling drop on the lamb's ear leaf, the trembling fingers reaching for it the moment they met. Later, as he walked back toward the granary, he paused beside the jar. He reached in and dipped 2 fingers into the cool water gathered days before. He lifted them slowly, watching the droplets slide down to his knuckle, then fall back into the jar with the smallest sound. He thought of all the mornings ahead, all the dew yet to be born, and the fingers that would gather it. Not only his, maybe one day others. Maybe hands even smaller than his had once been. Hands eager to learn, trembling to try. He would teach them not with instructions, but with silence, with example, with patience. He would place a cloth in their hands, lead them to a leaf heavy with water, and whisper only, "Let the drop come to you." And they would fail, perhaps, again and again. But eventually their fingers would soften, their breath would slow, and the dew would stay. He set the cloths gently beside the granary wall, folded and ready for nightfall. The sky above was dark now, deep and full of stars. He looked down at his hands once more, palms open, fingers spread like roots. They had weathered much, held much, let go of even more. But they still remembered the child they had once belonged to, the one who wanted so badly to hold the sky, and finally learned that to do so he must first become still enough for the sky to come to him. He exhaled, long and slow, and the wind carried it across the field like a promise. Then he turned toward the cloth line, fingers brushing the edge of the nearest weave, as softly as mist over stone. The night stretched before him, wide and waiting, and the dew, whenever it chose to come, would be welcome. The jar stood where it always stood, just beneath the granary's western wall, where morning light touched it only briefly, and the afternoon shadow kept it cool. It was not the largest jar he owned, nor the smoothest. In fact, its shape was uneven, slumped slightly to one side like a shoulder bearing too much weight. Its color had faded from sun and season, and on its rim, just beside the mouth, ran a fine crack. A slender, ancient wound that had once split the clay and nearly rendered the whole vessel useless. But he had mended it, not with fire or glaze, but with patience. He had found the crack years ago, one quiet morning after setting it down too quickly. The jar had tipped, knocked against stone, and the sound had rung out. A sharp, stony gasp. He had lifted it to find the damage already spreading like a vein across its lip. And yet, it hadn't shattered. It had stayed in one piece, trembling but whole, waiting to be touched again. He could have replaced it. Others had offered him newer jars, ones without blemish, without memory. But he had kept this one, and every morning since he had poured the dew into it. This morning the dew was heavy. The mist had returned in the night, thick and low, curling over the field like breath held too long. The farmer had risen early and gathered carefully, pulling beads from stone backs, wringing cloths soaked with the quiet blessing of sky. Now he crouched beside the jar, bowl in hand, watching as the last of the water trickled down the groove and into the vessel's shadowed mouth. The sound was soft. A trickle, a hush, a note too gentle to name. When the last drop fell, he wiped the bowl dry with a corner of his sleeve and placed it on the flat stone shelf beside the wall. He ran his hand over the jar's surface, fingers tracing the place where the crack had been sealed with pine resin and twine. He had taken the time to learn the mend, watched the old potters wrap thread through melted sap, binding wounds the way bark seals itself around storm breaks. The twine had darkened over time, blending with the clay, and now the crack looked like it belonged there, as if it had been part of the jar from the beginning. He didn't mind the imperfection. If anything, he trusted it more. Whole things could be careless. Fragile things learned to listen, and this jar, with its lopsided strength, had never once leaked a drop. It held everything given to it, not because it was flawless, but because it had been broken and made whole again. He sat beside it now, legs stretched in front of him, back against the granary wall. The light was beginning to slant down from the roofline, warm but not harsh. In the distance, bees whispered through fennel and lavender. Birds picked at the barley, wings fluttering in and out of sight. The jar rested beside him, heavy with dew, and he placed a palm on its curved side, feeling the coolness it kept in its clay. There had been a time, long ago, when he believed broken things should be hidden, when tools that cracked were discarded, when cloths that tore were cast aside. He had learned that from watching others, from listening to voices that spoke of perfection as proof of worth. But the land had taught him differently. Stones split in frost and still held sun. Trees broke in storm and grew branches around their scars. Even water, softest of all, wore away mountains with nothing but persistence. Everything broke, everything healed. He remembered a season when the rains had come too hard and too fast. The fields had flooded, the cloths had grown heavy and rotted, and the dew had vanished for weeks. In that time, he had almost stopped gathering. What was the point, he had wondered, if the water would not come? But one night, as he sat beneath the fig tree, this jar, this cracked-lipped jar, had tipped in the wind and caught the smallest stream of roof drip. In the morning, he had found a shallow pool at its base, clear and still. The jar had gathered without being asked. It had waited, and when the moment came, it had been ready. That, he realized, was the lesson. He reached into the jar now and stirred the surface gently with his fingers. The water moved without sound, circling the inner walls, catching light, carrying shadow. He lifted a palmful and watched it fall back in silver arcs. Not a single droplet escaped the crack. It was sealed, not with strength, but with understanding. The repair held because it had been made with care. He wondered, not for the first time, if the jar remembered the hands that shaped it, or the ones that broke it, or the ones that had chosen to mend it, slowly, gently, as he had done. He stood, lifting the jar with both hands. It was heavy but balanced, its weight familiar, as though the shape of his palms had always been carved into its sides. He carried it to the small table where the vessels waited. Smaller cups, clay bowls, a basin of grain to be moistened. With practiced motion, he poured a little into each, never hurrying, never spilling. The crack caught the light but did not protest. The water flowed, smoothly, as if it knew where to go. He set the jar down once more, its body a little lighter, its purpose fulfilled. He wiped the lip gently with cloth, tracing the crack again, not as flaw but as thread, something that connected past to present, damage to care, silence to song. It reminded him that not everything needed to be replaced. Some things only needed to be held long enough to remember how to hold. Later, he would place the jar back in the granary shade, where it would rest until the next morning, ready to receive whatever the sky chose to give. And he, too, would rest. His back was tired, and his knees ached slightly, but he felt no complaint rising in him. The day had asked for his patience, and he had given it. The jar had asked for his hands, and he had offered them. And tomorrow, when the mist curled again over the field, and the dew began to form on leaf and stone and cloth, he would rise once more, slowly, quietly, and gather it all. Not just the water, but the waiting, the remembering, the small silence of things that continue even after they break. He would pour it all back into the jar with the cracked lip, and the jar would hold it, as it always did. Not perfectly, but faithfully. The dawn arrived slowly, not with the blaze of sudden sun, but with the soft unfolding of light through mist and memory. The first farmer stood at the edge of his field, jar in hand, cloth folded over one arm, and for a long moment he simply breathed. Around him, the world stirred, not in loud calls or urgent movement, but in quiet shifts, a leaf dropping from a twig, a bird settling its wings, the slow breath of earth exhaling moisture. Today, he thought, the dew was enough. Not in quantity, not in weight, but in meaning. It had come to him, as it always did, bearing no promises but full of possibility. He had learned that gathering dew was less about possession and more about presence, a kind of conversation without words, where silence was the answer. He moved slowly among the stones, placing the cloth gently where it could drink, adjusting a bent branch just so. Every action was measured, patient, respectful. There was no hurry, there never was. The jar at his side was half full, a humble vessel holding the fragile gift. He traced the curve of its cracked lip with a fingertip, feeling the history that lived in its clay. The jar did not demand perfection, nor did it complain when its waters ran low. It held what it was given, steady and unassuming. The dew that filled it today was not abundant, but it was enough. And that was a blessing. He paused beside the dew garden, where plants drank not to grow large, but to endure. Lamb's ear leaves shimmered faintly with drops, chickweed sparkled quietly, and chamomile nodded in the gentle morning breeze. He knelt and brushed his hand over a leaf, sending a droplet cascading into the soil. The circle of water completed itself, returning to the earth that had birthed it. He watched the ripple fade and felt a deep satisfaction settle within. No need to gather all the dew, he thought. Some belonged to the field itself, to the roots and the soil. He understood that generosity was woven into the land. Water was shared, not kept. His role was not to take, but to receive and give back. To balance the silent economy of moisture where nothing was wasted and everything had a place. As the sun rose higher, the mist thinned and the dew retreated, pulled away by warmth and light. The cloths hung in the shade, drying slowly, their fibers still cool to the touch. The stones glistened briefly before settling into dry warmth. The branches straightened, releasing their bowed shape like a slow exhale. The field had given what it could, and the farmer had gathered what was needed. He carried the jar to the granary, placing it carefully on the cedar shelf. Nearby, smaller vessels waited, bowls for morning brews, cups for sharing, basins for soaking grains. Into each he poured a little of the dew, a silent prayer for the day's work. Some he reserved for seedlings, some for the goats that fed the children, some for the dye vats that colored cloth as brightly as the sky. Each drop held intention, kindness, and the patient rhythm of life. He sat down then, his hands resting on his knees, and looked out through the open door at the field, now bright with sun and song. The morning had settled into its course, steady and sure. He felt the weight of the dew within him, not just water, but the quiet knowledge of connection, of how small things could sustain, how waiting could become action, how enough was often more than plenty. Around him, the village began to wake, footsteps on stone paths, laughter spilling from huts, smoke rising from hearths. But here, in this quiet corner, time moved differently. It stretched and softened like the folds of linen drying in the breeze. The farmer breathed deeply, allowing himself to rest in that space. The task was done, the gift received, and the day ahead awaited. He rose slowly, gathering the cloths in the jar, and stepped outside once more. The field was alive with movement. Bees danced among wildflowers. Shadows lengthened and shifted, and the breeze carried the scent of earth and growth. He walked toward the grove, ready to tend the branches, to prepare for the next gathering. Yet, even as he moved forward, part of him lingered in the stillness of the morning, the moment when the dew was enough, when the world paused between giving and receiving, when silence spoke louder than words. That moment was a gift he carried always, like water held gently in cupped hands, precious and fleeting. And as the sun climbed higher, warming the earth and stirring the field to life, the first farmer continued his day, steady and sure, knowing that tomorrow, too, the dew would come. Not always in great measure, but always enough. He woke while the stars still threaded their pale needles through the fabric of night. The canopy above him breathing soft indigo. Sleep lingered like a veil across his eyes, but the hush of the hour called him gently onward, and he rose without haste. In his hand he carried only a small knife, honed thin as moonlight, and a woven pouch slung across his shoulder. Today would be a day for reeds. Not the green, water-thick stems that hummed with summer insects, but the slender hollow stalks already yellowing at the marsh's edge. Reeds whose hearts had been eaten away by time and beetle, leaving hollow flutes of silence through which the wind could pass. Long ago, his grandmother had told him that hollow things listened better than full ones, and that inside each empty reed lived an echo of every breeze that ever touched it. If one placed a reed to the ground at dawn, she said, the earth might speak back in droplets. He walked east, where the marshland lay flat and silver beneath a brittle crescent moon. The path was cool under his soles, damp with night's last breath. He carried no lamp, the sky was enough. A frog chirred once, then fell quiet. Somewhere far off, waterfowl rustled wings against dark water. He listened, counting the distance between sounds, mapping each soft noise against the shape of the land in his mind. Quiet was an ally, and he moved inside it like a shadow of moss, neither breaking twigs nor brushing tall grass aside. By the time the first seam of rose split the horizon, he was kneeling beside a cluster of reeds whose stalks leaned into one another as if sharing secrets. With careful fingers he felt for softness, any sign where the inner pith had eroded, leaving only the thin, resonant walls. Those would be the reeds that gathered dew best, channeling condensation along their hollow cores to rest in secret pockets near the root. He pressed thumb and forefinger around each stalk, listening for the faintest crackle that betrayed emptiness. When he found one, he severed it low with the knife and laid it on a clean cloth spread across his lap. He worked slowly, collecting only a small handful. Enough was always enough. The marsh would notice his absence, but not his greed. The sky bruised from lilac to pale gold. Mist lifted off the water in ribbons, drifting between reed beds, winding around his ankles with cool threads. The hollow stalks in his pouch clinked softly. Even empty, they carried music. He found a level patch of earth where mud met firm ground, knelt, and pushed each reed upright into the soil at a slight angle, tips leaning toward the breath of dawn. The trick, his grandmother had said, was to find the line where air moved slowest, where warm and cool currents met and sighed. That invisible boundary coaxed droplets inward along the reed's walls, drawing them downward until a clear note of water pooled inside. He sat back on his heels observing. Reeds stood like slim sentries, fine cracks in the day's first light. He could almost hear them drink. Around him, the marsh stirred awake. Dragonflies. Clattered, unseen fish kissed the surface with tiny pops, and a ripple of wings crossed overhead, herons shifting their weight as they plotted the day. He closed his eyes and slipped a breath between parted lips, slow and steady, letting his pulse match the tempo of reeds swaying. Time widened. When he opened his eyes again, dew was forming. Faint beads on outer walls, glimmering webs stretched between stems, and, most precious of all, the soft echo of water gathering inside. He took up the first reed, raised it to his ear, and tilted it. From within came a hush, a single droplet sliding, striking the hollow end with the smallest chime. He smiled, feeling the sound travel through bone and skin like a remembered lullaby. Carefully, he angled the reed over his cupped palm. A silver bead emerged, round as a seed, trembling on the lip before falling into his hand. Coolness spread across his lifelines, as light as breath. One drop, then another. He collected each, cradling them until a shallow pool formed. It would never be a torrent, yet the patience of such gathering felt deeper than a river. When his palm brimmed, he tipped the water into a clay vial kept warm against his chest. The vial would carry only a few mouthfuls by morning's end, water so slight that sunlight might drink it first. But he knew its worth. Reeds pulled not only moisture but the faint flavor of marsh-born herbs, of silt, of wind heavy with salt from distant sea. A tonic, his grandmother had called it, though she'd never explained for what ailment. He suspected it cured the quietest hunger, the longing to taste where earth and sky met in secret places. He moved from reed to reed, listening, tilting, catching. Each stalk sang its own note as water slipped free. Sometimes the bead clung stubbornly inside, and he would run a finger down the reed's length, coaxing it loose with a whisper. "Come now," he'd murmur, though words were unnecessary. They were for his own heart, reminding him to treat the world gently. By the time the sun had lifted a hand's breadth above the horizon, he had emptied 6 reeds, each yielding only a few drops, yet together filling the vial more than halfway. It was, he thought, an orchestra of small obediences, each reed offering its tiny gift to make a larger song. The remaining stalks he left standing, roots unbroken, mouths poised. Some gestures were better unfinished, promises kept for tomorrow. He gathered his pouch, knife, and cloth, then rose in silence, saluting the marsh with a nod. Light now spilled across the water, shattering into 1,000 mirrors. As he turned toward home, he glanced back once and saw tiny prisms flashing on the reed tips, droplets he had not harvested, sparkling like unsung notes. He felt no tug of regret. They belonged to the marsh, to the sun, to the thirsty wings of passing birds. The walk back carried the same hush as his arrival, yet the world felt newly tuned. Each breath of wind seemed to echo through the emptiness of the harvested reeds, whistling faint harmonies that followed him along the path. He thought of how sound traveled in hollow spaces, the rush of air through caves, the murmur inside seashells, the quiet hum of his own ribs when he spoke low against his chest. Perhaps the body, too, was a kind of reed, hollowed by time, shaped by invisible agents, made to resonate with every passing wind. We were meant to gather echoes, he mused, to hold them briefly, then release them as song. Approaching the granary, he found the field awake. Sun on barley heads, bees at the dew garden, cloth lines swaying with morning's breath. He stepped beneath the almond tree whose leaves still clung to tiny pearls, remnants of dew that cloth and stone had missed. He reached up, brushed a branch, and shook a light shower onto his shoulders. Cool droplets slid along his neck, meeting the warmth of sun already settling there. He smiled, letting the sensation spill over him like a grace. Inside the granary, the jar with the cracked lip awaited in shadow. He knelt and uncorked the vial, watching the reed water pour in, the stream so thin it scarcely disturbed the surface. Yet the water below accepted it without question, widening its circle by a breath. He placed the vial beside the jar, then sat cross-legged on the packed earth floor. The air smelled of straw, clay, and faint sweetness from stored grain. Light filtered in narrow blades through the slats, dust motes drifting like tiny seeds. He closed his eyes and let silence settle. In that stillness he heard the marsh again, the plink of droplets on hollow reed, the hush of wind sliding through tunnels of bone-thin walls. The echo lived inside him now, carried by the water resting in the jar. He imagined pouring it later into the cups of neighbors, into the mouths of seedlings, into the cracked earth at the field's edge. The echo would travel onward, unseen but present, like a spirit moving through roots, through blood, through time. Perhaps, he mused, every kindness traveled this way, emptied from one vessel to fill another, never lost, only changed. He rose before the stillness grew too deep, for work waited and sun climbed. Outside, he lifted cloths from their lines, folded them into neat bundles, feeling their coolness fade as air warmed. The cracked lip jar he left uncorked a moment longer, allowing the breeze to kiss the water's surface. He liked to think the echo needed fresh air before it could sing again. With the jar sealed at last, he stepped into the brightness of day. The field shimmered. Insects droned, and far beyond the grove a kestrel traced spirals against blue. He watched its flight, imagining the wind rushing through its hollow bones, making a sound no ear could catch. Reeds, bones, jars, hearts, each held cavern enough to cradle small, singing things. He carried the jar to the shade of the willow arches, set it upon a flat stone, and crouched to examine the leaves. They were dry now, drinking sun, but he touched them anyway, palm flat against their green, grateful. The water gathered today would make its rounds, a splash for the dye maker, a sip for the goat, a drizzle for the herb plot. And still some would remain, sleeping in clay until tomorrow. Enough always remained. He lingered, letting his gaze drift toward the horizon where marsh met sky. Somewhere out there, reeds he had left standing still caught the morning breeze, playing hollow notes no ear nearby would translate. Yet he felt their music in the steady beat of his pulse, in the ease of his breath. Empty spaces, he thought, were not forsaken places. They were chambers awaiting song, and gathering dew, whether from stone, cloth, leaf, or reed, was another way of tuning the silence of the world. The day stretched forward, full of humble tasks, mending fence posts, turning compost, checking grain. But beneath each motion ran the echo of the hollow reeds, a reminder that what seemed empty could become vessel, and what seemed small could fill a life. He lifted the jar once more, felt its gentle weight, and began walking toward the village path, where neighbors would greet him with quiet smiles and outstretched cups. The sun warmed his shoulders. The echo traveled beside him, unseen yet true, and the hollow spaces within and around him thrummed, ready to receive whatever note the world might next let fall. It began before he opened his eyes. A strange warmth in the air, as if the dawn had arrived too quickly. A faint scent that did not belong. Dry earth stirred with something metallic, faint but undeniable. The first farmer sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes against the pale half-light that crept across the floor. His limbs moved carefully, not from age but from instinct. The quiet felt different today, thicker, as though something unspoken was resting across the field. He stepped outside, and the light met him not in the soft blue of early morning, but in a muted, ruddy hue. The sky had turned the color of ash-stained clay, dim and glowing at once. The mist hung lower than usual, like breath pressed close to the ground, and where it curled along the grasses, it shimmered not silver, but crimson. He blinked, thinking at first it must be a trick of sleep or cloud, but the red was real. It coated the barley in glistening beads like rose-colored glass, shimmered in the grooves of stone, clung in droplets to every curve of cloth and leaf. The dew had come, yes, but it had come colored. He walked carefully through the field, his feet pressing gently into damp soil, already stained faintly pink. At first, he did not touch the dew, he only looked. The color was not alarming, not blood, not fire, but something else entirely. Rust, perhaps, or the pigment of clay dissolved into breath. And yet it was beautiful. Terrible in its difference, but beautiful. The earth had painted itself in silence. At the edge of the grove, where the willow branches still bowed, with habit, the cloths had soaked up the strange hue and darkened to the color of old wine. He knelt and lifted one gently, watching how the liquid clung to its fibers like pigment to parchment. When he wrung it, the water ran not clear but tinted, pale and pink, like water used to wash the hands of a potter. The jar at his hip remained sealed. He did not pour anything in yet. He needed to understand. He tasted it, just a single drop on the tip of his tongue. It was cool, familiar, not sharp, not bitter, no strange tang, the flavor was barely altered. And yet the sight of it unnerved something quiet within him, not in fear, but in reverence. He had known dew as a clear, colorless blessing, silent, invisible, until the light found it. To see it now, vivid and visible, was to witness a private act made suddenly public. He walked further. The dew garden shimmered like a field of tiny rubies. Every lamb's ear leaf, every sprig of chickweed, every stem of chamomile bowed beneath the weight of red droplets. He moved slowly through the plants, crouching to observe the way the dew had settled. It did not seem heavier. It did not stain the plants or wilt the stems. The garden had accepted it without question. The earth had not pulled away. Perhaps he shouldn't either. He turned to the stones, his oldest companions in this morning work, and there he saw the color deepened. The granite, the slate, the smooth river-washed slabs all bore the same crimson hue. Their natural depressions turned to pools of red mirror. He gazed into one and saw his reflection distorted, rippling under the tinted surface. He did not look away. He simply reached out, cupped one pool, and let it fall through his fingers. Not since the drought years had he felt this kind of silent wonder. Then, the awe had come from scarcity, from days when no dew arrived at all. Now, it came from abundance, yes, but of a kind he did not recognize. He dipped a cloth into the reddened water and carried it with him, watching the drops fall behind him as he walked. A trail of rose-kissed marks left on the soil, evaporating slowly. When he reached the granary, he set the cloth down and opened the jar. Its insides were clean, lined with the faint trace of yesterday's offering. He held the colored dew above it, paused, and then, without ceremony, poured it in. The water glugged gently, folding over itself, the crack along the lip drinking it without protest. The red glimmered briefly in the shadows before settling into stillness. He dipped a finger in and watched it drip from his fingertip. No stain, no sting. It was just water, touched by something unknown. The rest of the morning passed without sound. He did not speak. He did not pour the dew into other vessels. He left it in the jar and sat beside it, watching how the light played through its tinted surface. Villagers passed occasionally beyond the stone fence, carrying baskets, speaking low. One or two turned to glance at the field, slowed their steps. No one called out. Even they could feel the shift. Later, when the sun climbed higher and the mist receded, he returned to the field. The dew was already gone, absorbed or vanished. Only the memory of its color remained, in the darker marks on the cloths, in the scent of clay that lingered faintly in the wind, in the still weight of the water in the jar. He didn't know if the color would return tomorrow. Perhaps it was only this one morning. Perhaps it would never come again. He didn't ask why. Instead, he walked to the stream and rinsed the cloth gently, watching the color flow out like watercolor fading on the page. The cloth lightened. The stream accepted the tint without question. As he wrung it dry, he noticed the reeds near the bank held a few beads of untouched dew, clear, small, unmarked. He tasted one and found it familiar. He smiled. The red dew had not reached here. The stream and its reeds had remained untouched, a small reminder that not all things shift at once. He walked back through the sunlit field, the light now clean and white. Shadows softened. The air smelled of hay and wind. His hands, still damp, shimmered in the brightness. The jar waited on its shelf, and inside, the red water slept. He would use it carefully. Maybe not today, maybe not for drinking. Perhaps it was meant for the roots of something old, or the mouth of a seed waiting to be woken. Or maybe it was not meant to be used at all, only to be kept, remembered, and offered back to the earth when the time came. A gift given not to sustain but to remind. That even the most familiar blessing could wear a new face. That even water could arrive clothed in surprise. He sat by the granary wall until the wind shifted, until the shadows lengthened and the sky returned to its usual blue. He placed his hand on the jar and whispered a wordless thanks. Then he stood, cloth in hand, and walked again toward the field, knowing that tomorrow's dew might come clear, or colored, or not at all. Whatever it brought, he would be ready. He would receive it softly, with open hands and quiet awe. As always. As ever. Before light had a chance to divide the sky, the mist arrived. Not hurried, not pushed by wind or weather, but slowly, in a way that felt deliberate, like an old friend returning without warning. It flowed into the fields in slow, thick layers, threading itself between stalks, curling along the pathways, and folding over the dew garden with a hush that made even the leaves hold still. The first farmer did not rise immediately. He lay still in the dark, eyes open, breath slow, sensing something different in the air, not a warning, not a shift, only silence that felt full. When he stepped into the morning, the world had disappeared. There was no field, no sky, no grove. Only pale white pressing in from every side, soft as wool, dense as smoke without fire. He stood for a long time beneath the thatched awning of the granary, listening. The mist was not quiet. It moved, it murmured, it whispered over stone, skimmed the surface of the soil, turned the air into a hum. Not like rain, not like wind, but something in between, breath almost, as if the earth had fallen asleep and begun to dream aloud. He stepped forward, slowly, carefully, one palm trailing the wooden frame of the granary wall. He knew this land by heart, but the mist asked for caution, not because it threatened, but because it deserved reverence. The world shrank to the reach of his hands and the sound of his steps. His feet found the familiar path to the stone ring, but even the stone seemed to have vanished into the fog. He paused, crouched, and placed his hand on the ground. Damp, cool, waiting. The dew would be here, but not in beads or pools or droplets. It would be inside everything. Carried in, not gathered, whispered, not poured. Today, there would be no cloths to wring, no reeds to tilt, no stonebacks to blot with care. Today, the water did not want to be held. It only wanted to be known. The farmer straightened and walked without direction, letting his memory move his body. Past the fig trees whose shapes were hidden, past the bent branches he could not see but knew were there. All the familiar rituals had been softened by this breath of mist, and yet none of them felt lost. He passed the garden, though only by the scent of it did he know. The faint green sharpness of chickweed, the mellow sweetness of chamomile, the musk of damp soil just turned. The plants were awake, surely, but hushed. He reached down and brushed a lamb's ear leaf with his fingertips. It was heavy, saturated, weeping with the fog's embrace. Not dew, precisely, but not rain either. Something older, something deeper. He paused near the stone where he usually sat to wring the morning's work into the jar. Today, there was no bowl in his hands, no cloth heavy with beads. He sat anyway. The stone was cool beneath him, the kind of coolness that crept into his knees and spine and made him sit straighter. The mist thickened and thinned in waves, sometimes revealing the faintest outline of the tree line, sometimes folding it away again. It breathed. It listened. He closed his eyes. It was then he began to hear it. Not sound, exactly, but presence. The way silence speaks when it is full of something unnamed. The way mist carries memory. He did not move, did not reach for anything. He simply sat and let the air settle over him like a shawl. In the quiet, thoughts drifted. Old memories bubbled up. Not sharply, but gently, as if stirred by the mist itself. The sound of his grandmother humming while weaving, the scent of wet clay from the first jar he had helped fire, the feel of a child's hand in his, once, long ago, holding a tiny cloth too big for its fingers. He did not chase these thoughts. He let them pass, as the mist passed. Slow. Honest. Software time did not feel like time in this fog. It stretched like wool soaked in water, weighty, slow-moving, resistant to urgency. Eventually, the light shifted. Not brighter, but clearer. He opened his eyes and saw the jar. He had not brought it, and yet it was there, sitting quietly on the earth not far from his feet. Maybe he had carried it without knowing, or maybe it had always been here. It glistened faintly. Moisture clung to its sides, not gathered from cloth or reed or leaf, but from the air itself. It had drunk directly from the sky. He reached for it and touched the cracked lip. Beads of mist clung to the surface, running in slow lines down its shoulders. He tilted it gently and watched a thin thread of water slide from its opening, curl along the side, and disappear into the soil. Not much, not enough to store, but enough to notice. There would be no collecting today, no pouring, only remembering. Mist did not fill jars, it filled breath. It taught him that water did not always want to be contained. Sometimes it wished only to be known, to be felt on skin, to be shared with roots and leaves and air. He stood and left the jar where it sat, feeling it did not need to be moved. It had found its place. The mist still curled around his shoulders, but it had lightened. Enough now to see the barley swaying faintly in the breeze. Enough to find his way without his hands. Still, he moved slowly, as though moving through dream. He passed by the dew garden once more. The chamomile was heavy with water, its petals folded. The chickweed nodded low, its leaves dripping. The plants had accepted the mist without question. They did not need beads, they did not need ceremony, they simply drank. He paused by the willow arches and ran his hand along the nearest branch. The leaves were slick, but not weeping. They held the water like breath held in the chest. Soft, steady, without urgency. He thought of how often he tried to catch the dew, to cradle it, carry it, contain it. But today the mist reminded him, not everything must be held. Some things only need to be witnessed. By the time he returned to the granary, the mist had begun to rise. It peeled off the field like a slow tide withdrawing from shore. The stones reappeared, the cloth line returned to sight, and the almond tree came into full view, still beaded at its lowest branches. He stepped inside and found the shelf bare, save for the cloth he'd folded days ago, dry now, stiff with waiting. He did not hang it out. He let it rest. Some mornings needed no gathering. Some mornings were the gift. He sat beside the wall, back straight, breath calm, and listened as the last of the mist slipped out through the cracks in the wood. The silence it left behind was not empty. It was full of something that had no name, no weight, and yet pressed softly against the soul. Tomorrow, perhaps, the dew would return in beads and drops, would gather where it always did, would let itself be caught in cloth and poured into jars. But today it had spoken in mist, and he had listened. That was enough. The morning began in silence, as it always did, but with a hush so deep it pressed against his skin like breath held too long. The first farmer rose slowly, his body moving as if it remembered something his mind did not yet know. He stepped outside, and the air was already warm. Not hot, not harsh, but warm in a way that said the day had arrived early, and the dew had not lingered long. Overhead, the sky was clear, a soft peach beginning to pull open the eastern edge. This would be the last gathering for the season. He felt it in his bones. Not because something had ended, but because something had ripened. The jar sat beside the door, empty and waiting. The cloths had been washed the night before, their edges smoothed, their folds laid carefully. They rested over his arm now, familiar as old songs. The path beneath his feet was dry, and the grass beside it did not sparkle. Still, he walked toward the field, to the same places he always began, where the willow branches bent low, where the stone ring caught the first hush of morning, where the reeds leaned and whispered near the edge of the garden. Even if there was no dew to gather, he would go. The ritual was not just about collection. It was about being present for what might arrive. He stopped at the first cloth line and reached for the lowest branch. A single droplet rested on the underside of a willow leaf, clinging in defiance of the sun's slow advance. It caught the light like a pearl and quivered when he touched it. He held his palm beneath it, waited, and did not move. The drop hesitated, then released. It fell into his hand with a coolness so tender it silenced even thought. He turned his palm upward and watched it rest, whole and trembling. A last gift. He didn't need more. He placed the droplet in the jar with the reverence of someone burying a jewel. It did not make a sound. It was not enough to change the weight of the water inside, but it marked the moment, the last drop before the sun. He made his way around the field slowly, touching each place as if for the last time. The stones had warmed already, their surfaces dry and sun-dappled. The garden leaves bore the faint memory of moisture, but none to be taken. He did not mind. He did not search harder or look with desperation. He only walked, stopped, breathed, and bowed. Each corner of the field held something of him, something left over from seasons past. Every trail had his footsteps packed deep into it. The cloths had touched this wind before. The jar had gathered this air. By the time he reached the edge of the grove, the sun had lifted beyond the far hill, brushing the tops of the trees with gold. Shadows pulled back. Color returned to the world in soft pieces, leaf, bark, soil, sky. The birds had begun their morning songs, but they did not startle the hush in his chest. He sat beneath the almond tree, the jar between his feet, and looked out over the land. Nothing called to be done. No task whispered for his attention. It was the kind of stillness that follows understanding. He remembered when he had first begun this work, when his hands had trembled from wanting to do it right, when he had tried to catch every drop, to save them all, as if their smallness needed defense. And then the seasons had passed, and he had learned that not every morning was for gathering. Some were for listening, some were for waiting, and some, like this, were for knowing that nothing more needed to be collected. That fullness did not always mean weight. That one drop, when received with open hands, could carry the sky inside it. He reached into the jar and lifted the water he had gathered. What remained from mornings past, what had settled at the bottom in stillness. It was cool against his fingers, quiet. He did not drink it. He stood, walked to the center of the field, and poured it slowly into the soil, letting it sink back into the ground from which it had once risen. The earth drank it without sound, and the sun caught the last glimmer as it vanished. The gift had been given, and now it was returned. He folded the cloths one by one, placed them inside the granary, and turned back to the field for a final walk. Not to tend, not to check, not to do, but simply to be with it. He touched the bark of the fig tree, pressed his foot into the old path, let his hand trail through the tall grasses near the garden's edge. The wind stirred slightly, and for a moment it carried the scent of cool stone and damp linen, the scent of every morning that had come before this one. When he reached the edge of the property, where the stones marked the meeting between his field and the wild, he paused and looked back. The sky was now bright. The shadows were gone, and yet something soft still lingered in the light. The echo of the mist, the memory of the reed, the silence of the cloths hanging limp and dry. He took one slow breath, letting the morning settle into him fully, and then he stepped forward into the sunlight. The dew would come again someday, but not tomorrow, not soon. And that was not a sadness. It was simply the way of things. The last drop had fallen, the last cloth had dried. The jar would rest now, empty but whole, until the sky whispered once more, until breath thickened, until the hush returned, until the morning asked again to be gathered, slowly, with the hands of someone who still knew how to listen. And somewhere, the sun climbed quietly through the branches, and the soil held the water like a promise.